launch it.
Voilà.
Continue. Up.
Yes, continue.
Sorry. Oops, sorry. I'm still a bit lost. So welcome to all the participants to this webinar with Professor Eric Corijn on Brussels after the confinement. As you see, the session will be recorded and you will get afterwards the video record by email. For those who are not familiar with the webinar format, it's normal that you have no access to the camera and to the video. So the good thing is that we cannot see you. If you're on your pajamas, it's okay. There are no cameras. You will only see the panelists. And if you want to talk, then we invite you to use the chat or the questions and answers icon, which are at the bottom of the screen. Ana Iturriaga, the head of the European School of Administration, will introduce our speaker. And after the conference, we will take all the questions from the chat and from the questions and answers. And Ana Iturriaga will try to summarize all of them to ask Professor Corijn all your doubts or all your questions about the current situation. I think that's it from my side. I don't know, Ana, if I forget anything. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, Blanca Clara Mund from the school, who's always helping so efficiently in all our online talks. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to yet another one of our sessions. I think this is number, I don't know, 20 or something. we have started, and we have seen the amazing take up from your side, and we're really happy to, as you like it, we continue giving you some. So we are always trying to find issues of interest that can help you in these particular times that we're living. And of course, today is a very, very interesting issue, because it is not just about what's going to happen to us after the confinement, but also where is going to happen to us. This is particularly relevant today for our colleagues in Brussels. And before we actually talk a little bit about the session and our speaker that we welcome very warmly, I would like to tell you that I know it's really hard times for everyone. I include myself. I have a full house here. My kids might be coming in and out, so I excuse myself already. But we have gone to online. We have gone online and digital overnight, many of us, and we need a bit of help with that, because we're not all native digitals, or digital natives, sorry. So we have put together in the school our heads together and said, what can we do to help colleagues, and how can we really start working well online? And we have looked at things like how to communicate when you're communicating through a screen, how do you have to write so to colleagues to not get upset, how to manage a team virtually, how to find that little blurry line between the personal and the private, between the private and the professional. So all those things are together in what we call the survival kit for teleworkers, and we invite you to look at it and to try to see if there's any session that is good for you, because it has been made for that, to support you in these particular times. And what are we going to be talking about today? Today we're going to be seeing what is waiting for us in the coming days and weeks as we slowly and gradually get out of our confinement. And how are we going to go back to our new normal, if there's such a thing? And for that, we wanted to count with good experts that can really support us in this special times, as I was saying. And we have chosen for this today Professor Corijn, who is a great friend of the school. He has been working with us for many years, and with you, because basically his main intention is to try to help us, those officials that are living here for so many years, to really integrate and fully live the city of Brussels, so that we, and that they can also, the city of Brussels can enjoy us. I think that that's a very good tandem. He's a professor at the university at the VUB. He's also the founder of Cosmopolis, which is a center for urban development, and he's Also, as I said, collaborating for many years, getting a few of our colleagues to experience the city fully, to understand how does it work in many different facets, and also is receiving our newcomers regularly with the session Discovering Brussels, that if you haven't gone to one, I really recommend once we get back to the office. It's a great one. So, Professor, I think that I have said enough. We're really looking forward to see, as you were saying before, you're going to give us a little bit of a general overview about the different facets of getting back to life in Brussels, and that you will give us some ideas, but you will also leave some open questions, because I know that very few people have answers today to anything, but I will very gladly give you the floor, and looking forward to your words. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello to everybody. Thank you for having me one day before Europe's Day, but also at this very important day, 75 years after the end of the war, which was not just a war between European countries, but which was a war between fascism and democracy. And so I think in these days we have to commemorate that, because that struggle is not finished yet. Yes, I'm going to speak about Brussels, about this city, about this specific ecosystem. But let me, as a general remark, start with saying that what we are doing is speculating, because a lot of people, we are in a pandemic that is exceptional in a certain way, exceptional because of the confinement, which is the first time. In fact, that such big measures have been taken. Everybody has been put in his home, as we say in Flanders. Blijf in your kot, stay in your home. So it's very exceptional, and we don't know how we are going to come out, because we don't know all the variables. So nobody is sure. Everybody is working in models with scenarios. And why is that? Because, of course, it's going to depend about behavior, about human behavior. And if there is one thing that is very difficult to model and to regulate, then it is individuals' behavior. And as we will see now with the first days of the exit strategies in Brussels from Monday onwards, the shops are going to get open. We can invite some people at home. Well, we will see what the effects are on the pandemic. So let's start this kind of speculation. I've noted down some thoughts, written some texts about that, and to put everybody in the right, let's say, in the right state of mind. What is this Brussels ecosystem? 1.2 million inhabitants with a very diverse population. So that's a very important element. 1/3 of the population has no Belgian nationality. So 2/3 more or less are Belgians, but half of those 2/3 are of a foreign origin, which means that it's a city where the majority of the population comes from elsewhere, which is exceptional. It's the most diverse city in Europe. And then, of course, within that Belgian population, you have the two communities that are represented in Brussels. It's an economic center of the city, 710,000 jobs, of which 90+% are service jobs and caring jobs, which of course is important, because distance working, not in the caring sector, of course, but in the service sector, is more easy than in the production sector. It's a city with a very rapid industrial decline, which explains that there is still 18% of unemployment and a very high poverty rate of 30%. So 1/3 of the population in the capital of Europe is living on or below poverty lines, which of course is, for instance, and I will come back to that, is of course a big problem for the housing situation. We only have 8% of social housing. 43,000 households are on waiting lists for social housing. So the housing situation is very different in Brussels. So one of the things I want to ask you to keep in mind if we discuss this exit, that the exit conditions for different people are radically different. That there is a social geography in Brussels with a very poor canal zone, in fact, with southeastern neighborhoods that are better off, in fact, and so a very important east-west divide. And that, of course, is complemented with the institutional segregation and fragmentation. I don't have to tell you, these people are living in one city region, the Brussels capital region, where two communities are functioning as far as culture and welfare and schooling, education are concerned, and we have 19 local municipalities. So what did we learn with this very exceptional situation of confinement? I think the first thing to think about is if you say to the people, stay in your home, it is very, very difficult to apply that when you have a single house with a garden, with 3 floors, where you can, with your kids, send them to their own room, etc. Or whether you...
Eric,
yes?
Can I interrupt you? It's just because, just to clarify, somebody in the chat is saying, do we have 2 communities? Is it 2 communities? Or...
Well,
clarify that.
We have institutional communities. So Brussels, as far as personal matters is concerned, culture, welfare, sports, education, you have the Flemish community with their own schools, and you have the French-speaking community with their own schools. Of course, in reality, culturally spoken, as a sociologist, I would say you have much more communities, of course. And you have national communities, ethnic communities, religious communities, different sports clubs with their communities. So in reality, people belong to multiple communities, but institutionally, and that is exceptional, there's not that many cities in the world where the school system is not governed by one governing body, where there are 2 governing bodies, where you have in each neighborhood a Flemish and a French-speaking cultural center, where the libraries are separated, etc., etc. That's very specific to the Belgian state form.
Thank you.
So I was saying that the situation, the concrete situation for people for the confinement is very difficult. If you have a house with a garden in the southeastern neighborhoods, for instance, or if you are confined in the canal zone. And so the density of the city is very different. Brussels is a very densely populated city, about 7,500 people per square kilometer. London is the most densely populated. But of course, there's a very different situation in Saint-Josse. For those who know Brussels, one of the 19 municipalities, where you have 18,000 per square kilometers, and if you compare that to Watermaal-Boisfort, for instance, where you have 2,000, or Oudregem or Uccle, 3,000. So the density of population is very different, and that means that if you look at the surface per inhabitant to be confined, your own house, and then the public space that is at your disposal, it is absolutely different. In the canal zone, it is less than 30 square meters per person. In the more wealthy of neighborhoods, it is nearly 50 square meters. So it's nearly half to double the space you have to live in. And that explains, for instance, why it is much more difficult to apply the rules in the densely populated popular areas in Brussels, and why you have yesterday still, for instance, youth riots in Anderlecht or Kuregem, where young people are gathering against the rules, where they are harassing the police, where it's much more difficult to keep that. And that leads me to a second big point, that is the quality of public space. Because one of the how would I say, acceptable practices in the way in Belgium the confinement was governed is that we were allowed to walk, allowed to do sports, allowed to go to public spaces and have some, let's say, physical activity. But of course, there again, it's very difficult. People say, and that's true, Brussels is one of the greenest cities of Europe, but we forget to say that that is because there is a lot of gardens. So most of that greenery is, on the one hand, private space, and on the other hand, the big woods, the wood in the southeast of the city. So as far as green space is concerned in the city center, it is not well off. And so for people in those neighborhoods to do their walks, etc., if you are confined to 1 kilometer around your house, some people go immediately in parks and green spaces, others not. So there is one big question, I think, that is in the exit strategy at the agenda. It is the deficit of space for a number of people, of accessible space, of green space. And that is of course an important element, and that leads me to a third question. That is that the government took, in my view, good measures. That is to reorganize the allocation of space. We know that Brussels, since the World Exhibition of '58, has become a city for cars. The public space and the roads are occupied by cars in Brussels, of which, amongst us, 90% is standstill cars, as parking lots. Cars are only used 9% of their time, basically. So cars is a very irrational way of mobility. And so what happened, of course, is that one of the measures is to rethink the mobility plan. On the one hand, by sharing the space and reducing the speed to 20 kilometers an hour today and having shared space. That means that in most of the city center and a number of streets in the other municipalities, you have now the rule that pedestrians and cyclists have the priority over cars, and that cars have to share that space at 20 kilometers an hour. And so one of the big things is, of course, in the exit strategy, are these confinement measures, in fact, going to have a permanent effect on the exit or not? That is going to be, I can assure you, a very big discussion, which is already in social media happening. That is the mobility strategy. The fourth point I want to mention is the question of security and behavior. I think in general, we have to say that the population has been very disciplined. The measures have been followed up rather easily. And I think in public space, in the food shops, etc., people are behaving rather well. Of course, there are some problems. And the main problem, and that I think is something that we have to learn, is that the measures are taken by adults. Adults that are, let's say, starting off from, let's say, a conception of a conscious individual. And the measures are not taken, let's say, in favor of young people. Kids have been underestimated, their right to play have been underestimated, and especially adolescents have not been taken into consideration. And I think one of the big problems still is what is going to be the effect on, for instance, the education confinement, the fact that schools have been closed down, that collective learning has been reduced to individual distance learning and dependent on the possibility of the parents to help that, etc. Nearly 20% of our young people have been disconnected of the education system on a permanent or an intermittent basis. So I really think that one of the elements of the exit is what with education, what with the young people, and especially also what with the young people in the popular neighborhoods, where we see that there is again, a lack of space and a lack of collective infrastructure. The sports centra, every infrastructure has been closed down, and that is a big tension. So I think there is some, how would I say, some thinking necessary on what is the policy towards youth and young people. Another element, I'm just going through my list, is this whole question of food. I have been, I think on the first base, if we're thinking about the exit, I think people have got the time, 2 months now, to make the difference between the essential and luxury. I really think the confinement has learned us to feel what is essential, what is daily needs, what is really needed, and what is in the register of desire, of luxury, etc. My real question is, did we really miss that much fun shopping? Did we really miss the possibility of wandering around each Saturday and thinking, shall we spend some money or not? The essentials have been there. And one of the essentials, of course, is food. First remark is that the food supply has been sufficient, which is, I mean, we think that is obvious and normal. It's absolutely not obvious at all, because this depends on global supply chain. If the port of Antwerp would be closed for government measures or for reasons of pandemic reasons, if a number of dockers would have been ill and that there would have been problems, 2 or 3 days later, we would have the effects in the food supply in most of the cities. Cities are, their dependence on global food chains is very, very important. And I think one of the reflections that we have to maintain in the exit is, how do we produce our food? I've always said, nobody knows exactly who is eating the food produced in the surroundings of Brussels. That food is sent to the big markets and is then in the global supply chains. Nobody exactly knows where the meat that is produced in industrial ways is really consumed. And I think one of the reflections today is, how can we, first of all, control the quality of food? And secondly, how are we going to localize food production and distribution? And that's an important element, I think, in the thinking, which has to do with the greening of the city. So if we make green space in cities, and we will have to do that, it should not only be recreational space, but it might be productive green space with gardens, with urban agriculture. And so one of the fields of research today and of planning is to rethink the plan. I remind you that Brussels has a good food plan, which is thinking this, let's say, changing of the food production and food consumption. And that, of course, is related to other types of circular economy. One general remark is, I think that the globalization, as we have known it with a global single market nearly for over the last 30 years, has ended now. We see that the connectivity, the global connectivity, has changed radically. I don't think that the air connections are going to be restored as before. On the one hand, we are going to reduce, or we will have to reduce, our travels by distance meetings, like this kind of meeting. And there's going to be a reduced mobility, I think, of in the global population. and also of goods and even of capital. So there is a form of localization of the economy, of societies. And I think that that localization, and that is a discussion, of course, today we think that is a localization country by country, because, of course, the state that has regulated this pandemic, between brackets, I have to remark that the global system has collapsed. The G9, the G20, the UN has hardly really functioned in this global pandemic. There is a very difficult global regulation. The EU institutions have tried their best, but what we have seen is a confinement to the national level. It's national policies, independent nationality, in fact, that has governed or tries to govern in different ways this pandemic. So I think we're going to come out with it with a whole reflection on localization and thus on proximity. One of the philosophical questions is, we will have to live together with the people around us, but from a distance. How can we distance proximity? How are we going to organize the proximity in 1.5 meters? And that brings me to a next point, that is, how is the economy going to recover? Again, it's speculation, and there are different schools. One school is saying we have to restore, we have to go back to normal, as if normal is the situation before. We have to go back to last year, and the investment in the economy should be oriented in maintaining what has existed. Now, I don't think that is going to be a realistic scenario. I really think we are going to go to, well, I'm not the only one, of course, but all the figures show that there's going to be an economic recession or a reduction. The figures are, if you follow the press and the scientific articles, it's between, let's say, 9% or 10% and 30% reduction. There's going to be a reduction. It's not only going to be a reduction in all the economic activities, but in certain economic activities. So there's going to be a lot of bankruptcies, which is going to increase unemployment, is going to increase poverty. So at the one hand, an economic question, on the other hand, a very social deficit that is going to be there. My personal take on that is that, and one of the articles I wrote during the confinement is, we have to think rebuilding the city also from below. That means that we have to start thinking also the, let's say, local community, let's say the neighborhood, the walking, the services and the economy in walking distance, the local, the proximity economy, and try to think that as a, let's say, as a circular type of economy, with a number of, I don't have the time to go into the details of that, but I think local commerce has to be supported more than the global commerce. We have to drink our coffee when Horeca is opening up again. We have to drink our coffee in the local cafe rather than in Starbucks, which is money that goes circulating in the world. So I do think that the global chains are going to suffer even more than the local networks that have to be sustained. And these local networks should not only be purely, you could say, entrepreneurial, commercial activities, but also with a social goal. I have been advocating, for instance, to organize local cooperatives per neighborhood to manage, let's say, collaboration between different types of commerces and shops to connect them also with social services, with redistribution mechanisms, and to think a kind of, how would I call it, the idea of a welfare neighborhood, of building on the solidarity that absolutely is also part of the confinement. I don't know whether in the other countries, yes, in the other countries the same. At 8 o'clock we applaud for all the services that risk their life and their health to sustain collective services, the health service, for instance. So my point is, let's use the exit to rebuild certain forms of social connectivity that are much more connected to the economy, and so not purely to individualized market economy, but to the commons, making urban commons, making a new type of social relationship. I'm heading to some final remarks, and one of the sectors that is really, how would I say, of great concern to me is what is not going to be opened that fast. And the whole leisure sector, and especially the culture and the arts, are suffering a lot today. Everybody is, of course, concerned with sports events. How are we going to restart that? But again, theater, all the let's say the immaterial wealth of being together, we don't have a clue how we are going to start that. I don't know what your ideas are, but I cannot imagine a theater where we will have only 50 seats with 1.5 meters in between us, and to experience something that is in fact built on collective emotion, on sharing emotion. And it's a very difficult thing. And I think that arts and especially theater, opera, etc., are going to a long phase. It's going to last another year to recover there, and I think there's going to be a lot of deficit there, and we don't think about it. Today there is no measures. So to wind up, the way I am approaching it, I think to start is again to that this is very exceptional, and so I'm very annoyed by a lot of discussions at the social media where people ask, and when this and when that, and how do I to do it. A lot of people have not integrated that we will not go back to normal as before, that we will have to reinvent living together in another way than before. There is not going to be a vaccine in the very, very near future. There is not going to be enough resistance in the population to just do and gather as before. And so reinventing that needs, I think, citizenship by everybody and collective thinking, collective, I would say, investment by everybody. And in that sense, my main concern is to think about at what scale do we do that? What are the different scales? We are not in a world that is going to be confined in territories. A country, and today we are I always say, when I discuss with newcomers, for instance, and discuss on the function of Brussels as the capital of Europe, one of the big problems of Europe that it's a system of member states, and that a number of, let's say, of the mental mapping of people is not shared at the European level. There is hardly any Europeanness developed. We still think that we are member of a nation state. And we in Belgium, we have learned more because we have a state. We don't know whether it's still a nation. We are building two nations within that state. And the city of Brussels is a good example to see that that does not work anymore. We are not living together with people of the same kind. We are living together with the people of different kind. And that's exactly what Brussels is a good laboratory for. A city is not a country. So I do think that the first scale to think about recovery of society is the local ecosystem, which is, let's say, the city plus its immediate environment, plus its hinterland, the metropolis. And we have to think an ecosystemic transition, also for reasons of climate change and for reasons of, let's say, managing resources and distributing resources at that level. I think the recovery of an economy, of a local economy at that scale is important. And the second question is that these scales are not connected territorially in concentric circles. These scales are connected in networks. And I always favor, of course, rethinking Europe and the European Union, which I'm a very fond supporter of the unification of Europe, but the unification of Europe as a network of metropolitan areas, metropolitan local regions. And that is a complete new way of thinking, let's say, the spatial organization. In Brussels, and I will stop with that, in Brussels we have a regional development plan that thinks the city in 4 scales. The neighborhood, and then the local centers. There are about 50 local centers that are functioning for different neighborhoods. And then we have some regional centers like the media center, the university area, like the Congress Center in the Heysel, etc., which is thematic but functioning for the whole region. And then we have, of course, the metropolitan center in the Pentagon, in the city center, in the canal zone, that is functioning for a wider region. At these different scales in Brussels, different planning and different, let's say, policies are necessary. To do all that, my dear audience, we need leadership. And leadership is not authoritarian leadership, as in some countries is still thought. And some of that authoritarian leadership, I mean, luckily outside Europe, they're worse than we are. If you look to the strongest country still, the United States of America, the way that is governed today is absolutely a shame for humanity, I think. So leadership, and leadership means today collaboration with your citizens towards what we call in science a foundational economy. The basic needs of people have to be guaranteed locally. It is absolutely, I mean, appalling that we are dependent on Chinese cheap labor to produce our mouth masks. That is not part of our daily subsistence, basically. So we are going to reintroduce a lot of daily needs production locally, and that needs to rethink, let's say, economy and ecology together, government, economic, entrepreneurial businesses, and citizenship together. And so this transversal thinking is at stake today. But again, how that will work, I'm not Madame Blanche. I only can deliver some of the fields of thought. And in the end, it's really going to depend on each of us, what type of connections. If we are going to remain egocentric individuals that only look at the outside world as services and what is therein for me, well, I think that we are going to face new pandemics or new other crises, and that we are going to a dissolution of society. If we are thinking ourselves as connected to the others, and that we have to contract that connection, that we have to think that connection together, well, then the pandemic and the confinement is a good starting point to rebuild some of the old normals that are not very functional anymore, and to rethink. So it's, let's say, we can hope that part of society, of solidarity and connectivity and bothering and living together with the others is going to win over individualism. And then we can really rebuild it, I think, in a transitional way, inventing innovation. And I really think we should, and the Green Deal is part of that, but it's also a question of social inequality fighting. It's also a question of reinventing culture as an interculture, as culture for connecting different groups and different languages. Europeanness could be one of these signifiers, meaning that, and I'm at the side, in fact, of thinking a better future after this confinement, based on the solidarity and the basic needs that we have experienced in these, well, for the rest, rather boring, I have to say, rather boring last two months. And I hope we can come out of that. We can go to a happier situation in the next few months. So thank you for your attention. I'm open to questions.
My God, you are, it's exploding, the chat and the questions. So I will try to make a bit of a summary of what I'm getting. Apologies in advance to those colleagues that I don't manage to ask a question, but I'm trying to cluster them a little bit. So the first cluster that people are asking is, you have spoken very eloquently about the need to go local and to really foster all our local and neighborhood economies and services. So the question is how to promote local economy collectively post-corona. How can we do that?
Well, two elements in the answer. First of all, I think we have to rightly so define the local. And the local does not mean the territory of the local government. If you look at Europe in general, but also in Brussels, etc., it is not the municipality that is the local. The local is a local ecosystem. And we have to get out of a notion of the city as the built environment, and then the rural area would then be the non-built environment. We have to rethink cities where nature and built environment is connected with each other. So my first remark is, let us study and think out of the box, out of the institutional organization, and define the local as a local ecosystem that has some ecosystemic services, has some, let's say, resources there. And then we have to think, second step, what can we produce and consume? How can we, in this kind of environment, and that means that especially oriented to basic needs. And for me, basic needs are, of course, we know that it's housing. So housing policies are important. It is food quality and food production and food distribution. And then it is elements that have to do with education, school systems, school programs, etc. So localization for me is, how would I say, starting from a scale that is an objective scale, and not a political scale only. And just the last sentence added to that, for me, localization is globalization. It is not returning to local traditions and local cultures. Every city today is closer to the world than the country. A city of Brussels is more than Belgium, in fact. A city of Brussels is a good example. It is a compact world. And so we have to live together in that local as if it is a world. We are.
A question that a lot of people are asking, sorry, Eric, is that how can we as EU officials contribute to that? You know, how can we be much more part of that and integrate much better the city and help to make it grow and prosper?
Well, that's a very difficult question because it depends. So there is not one model of European staff, of course. My personal stake, and I speak openly, I think that the European Union today is, how would I say, weakened by its basic structure as a club of member states. Because what we see happening is that the member states are thinking in the first place in their own interest, in their own culture, in their own political sphere. And I do think that the European Union has to be complemented by the reality of the European space. And the reality of the European space is, on the one hand, that there is a center and a periphery, that the blue banana really exists, that in less than 20% of the surface of Europe, you have 60% of the population and 3/4 of the economy concentrated, and that peripheral zones are confronted with that. Eastern Europe and Southern Europe is confronted. So that's the single market reality is like that. And secondly, that a lot of these people, that the majority of Europeans are living in cities, in urban contexts. Well, and I think that spatial structure and that demographic structure is not represented in the European Union. So my personal suggestion would be to develop, you could say, the Committee of Regions into a committee of metropolitan areas, to empower cities and to empower collaboration between cities. Personally, I'm very much invested in what Eurocities is doing, in the new Horizon planning, where cities get an important role, where knowledge and urban contexts are exchanged. So well, how would I say, but who am I? But my suggestion would be to focus on such elements in the reconstruction, in sustainable urban development, and have a cosmopolitan approach or a European approach within these cities.
Actually, now that you touched about the issue of the regions and the whole ecosystem around the city and the regions, they're asking here that how can it be that you need to have good infrastructures, obviously, and they're asking, some of our colleagues are saying that how can it be that one of the richest per capita capitals in the world, in Europe, sorry, has got such weak infrastructure in terms of commuting, for example. How is this going to affect the commuting of our colleagues once the confinement is over?
Yes. Well, the reason for that is relatively simple. Brussels is, as an economy, the second or the third richest region of Brussels, but as population, it is a relatively poor population, because that economy is produced for more than half, produced by people not living and not being taxed in Brussels. The richer part of our producers, of our workforce, in fact, is living in the periphery of the city. In that sense, colleagues should understand that the Belgian elites are anti-urban, are living in the periphery. In some other cities in Europe, the wealthy people, the elites, are living in the city center and are, of course, determining the development of the city. And that means, of course, that in Brussels, to give you one example, half of the Brussels population does not have a car, but it's the Brussels region that has to maintain tunnels, or a tunnel system or an entry system into the city for all the commuters. 260,000 cars every day come in from the outside with one driver and with a single person in the car mainly. And so the reason for that is that the wealth of the city, maintaining an infrastructure, is an infrastructure for commuters that are not contributing to that system. And so if everybody would pay taxes locally, don't want to speak about your situation, if everybody would pay taxes to Brussels, I know you pay taxes, but not to the Brussels infrastructure, and that infrastructure is paid by people who are poorer than the Belgian average, for instance.
Some people are asking, why don't we tax commuters?
Yes, that's one of the things at stake, but the reason, of course, in the Belgian federal system is that there would be a retaliation from the other regions and saying, okay, then we withdraw economic activities from Brussels and we relocate them in Antwerp or in Liège or in Charleroi, if we can't come in free to work in this urban center. So it's a difficult question. Personally, I really think that if people are using infrastructure without contributing by ways of tax, that could be a contribution like exists in the roads, the speedways in France, for instance, or tunnels, so it's not very exceptional to be taxed for using some specific infrastructure.
There's some questions also when you were talking about how we can contribute to the development of our local business and culture. Somebody's saying that in the US there is a big use of the crowdfunding as a way. Do you think this is going to happen more? Should we foster that much more than we have so far?
Yes, I really think that, well, contributing to collective projects is better than just spending your money for your own sake. This being said, the tax system in the United States is much lower than, for instance, in Belgium. In Belgium, the combination of tax and social security contributions is half of your income. So there's a lot of let's say official institutionalized contribution already. There is crowdfunding going on, and we should use that money also better. I don't think that crowdfunding can replace taxing, and that taxing has to be better used, in fact, for collective needs. So that's my generic answer, but that being said, I am for voluntary cooperation, and crowdfunding is one of the means to that.
And somebody going on this taxing question is asking, shouldn't it be better to give all the taxes to the federal level or the state level so that they can decide where that infrastructure should be reinforced?
Yes, of course. It's again a question of scale, because is it then the federal distribution who is going to decide where the metro lines and where streets are going to be allocated? So it's a big discussion. But one of the elements which is interesting, one of the proposals that exists is to pay half of your tax where you live and half of your tax where you work. Because if more and more people are working outside their place of housing, of living, it is not very rational to pay the tax from your home. Why is your home the only address where you pay taxes? So there is of course different means, and one of the main means, of course, is that all those who do not pay taxes, and I don't mean individuals, but companies and frauding, that should be blocked. That there is a big discrepancy on the amount of money, existing money, and the amount of money that is then allocated to collective or to public needs.
There are quite a few questions about the future, of course, and how you were very eloquently explaining all the things that we have learned from this crisis. And the question here is, do you think that we will really learn, meaning that, for example, in terms of pollution and industrial production, so we have seen the amazing consequences of the lack of production in terms of good news for the environment, but do you think that's going to continue afterwards, or it's going to be impacting too much the economy? How much are we going to be learning from this experience, and how much do you think that's going to be changing the way we produce and the way we consume?
Well, there the question is, of course, who are we in the question? It's a very political question. Personally, I think that every individual is going to learn something from that experience. It is such an exceptional, a laboratory experience that it is absolutely impossible that there is no lessons from that. Everybody is going to think about it at the level of its interpersonal relationships. I mean, I didn't speak about the increase of violence in families, which is a big problem in the confinement. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned. One of the lessons, of course, is that we cannot live alone. I hope that is a main lesson for everybody, that we need others and that we need to arrange something with the others. The second lesson I hope everybody individual will learn is that the environment has got some advantages. The fact of needing to walk more with less cars in the road is changing, let's say, our experience. We have once a year a car-free day in Brussels, which enjoys a lot of people. Well, we lived two months now with a reduction of cars in the city, 40–50% reduction, and the use of public space in another way. I hope that experience will help some people to learn. But finally, the question is a political question. And so, I would say empirically, what we can see is the policies, for instance, in Brussels, which has a progressive coalition, you could say, are different than, for instance, in Antwerp, where you have a more conservative leadership. In Ghent are different from. So the answer would be, in the end, it depends on the political orientation of the scale that is managed. And if we are going to structurally learn of it, it's not individuals who can change the structure of society. That's the democratic procedures. And then it depends, as an individual, we can engage more in that. Maybe more people are going to engage in collective endeavors. But in the end, of course, it's the political leadership who is going to decide what we learn and if we learn something.
And another cluster of questions regards education and work. The future of work, the future of education. You pointed out to the fact that, of course, the digital gap is creating a lot of inequality between those who can afford to join into this new way of educating and working. But what I was quite surprised with the figure. I think if I got it right, 20% of kids are out of the education system now because of the online.
Well, not permanently out, but yes.
But because of this situation. So how do you see, I mean, how are we going to be impacted in terms of education, and how to make sure that sizable amount of our population will not be disconnected?
Yes. Very important questions. Well, let me first take the question of education. First of all, let me state that education is an absolutely necessary public service. So it is not going to be replaced by any other system. That is what we learned also. So teachers are important, the contact with teachers are important. And in the end, I really do think that regrouping kids from different households in a space together with teachers is the core business of education. It's not only about exchanging knowledge or giving assignments or doing house work, etc. So we only experienced, I think that the school is only partially replaced today by distance learning. This being said, we have learned now that there is a lot to do. First of all, you can learn with different settlements. You don't have to be in your own class only. You have other types of knowledge shared. If we want to use that more structurally in education, we will have to give to everybody the necessary infrastructure and the necessary basic skills. For me, that's absolutely simple. I am in favor of free education and free education for all. And so I'm really a supporter of public education systems, and that needs that we have to find ways to distribute computers and distribute internet connections to those who don't have it, and to be aware that the personal support that you need to do that needs cultural capital. And what we have experienced today is that middle-class families, they complain because a lot of my colleagues at the university that have to teach themselves from home at academic level, but with 2 kids running around that have to do at the same time their assignments for their school at different levels, etc. The combination of, let's say, being a father or a mother and a teacher yourself and a housekeeper it's absolutely impossible if there is no time schedule. So overall, I do think, to conclude, that the school system is very important. We have not invested enough to that. So it's not only the health system that are our heroes, but also our teachers, I think, that we will have structurally more use of computers, but that needs social distribution of them. And the last remark is about the contents. I really do think that what we learned, or what we should learn, is that these disciplinary organization of the education, you learn physics and then chemistry and then history, has to be replaced more and more by project learning, by transversal problem-solving learning, and by type of assignments where a complex problem is related and where different disciplines are used as let's say help desks, in fact, to solve problems and thinking like that. And so again, for me, for instance, the education involved in this localization should also be thought. Do we need only national programs, or do we also need to educate people to live in their neighborhood, to live in their city, to live in their immediate region with specific contents adapted to that? I think the contents of the courses have to be adapted also to the globalization movement, in fact, that is going to follow, I think.
And when you're talking about adaptation of different models, what about, you were mentioning, and it links a little bit to the previous question, we have a lot of people that are affected today by what is going on, that are in the less privileged positions. And how can we ensure that they can be part of the decision making? Yes. How can they be part of whatever we plan or we decide on? So how could we do that?
Yes, there's a big I mean, I have to solve all the, yes, but it's again a big question. We can only do that through campaigning for democracy. It's the right day today to say that, I mean, this phase of confinement is an authoritarian phase. We have to admit that our individual freedom has to be submitted to the collective needs, and so that is an important element. So if we are going to open the system up again, we need to take everybody on board, and not only the elites, in fact, that adapt very rapidly. And so our point I want to make is we have to campaign for democracy through education, through campaigns, to put that, for instance, to making the 8th of May again an official, let's say, an official leisure day in the whole of Europe, and making it a special element, not just for the recovery of democracy. And so really, I really think we have to put a special effort after the exit strategy to take everybody on board on the collective matters. Because a lot of the poor people do not only lack cultural capital, they especially lack material capital. And they are really overwhelmed by immediate material problems as to be involved in the collective. This being said, in a lot of popular areas, there is much more solidarity today, much more collective discipline today than in middle-class neighborhoods. So it's not the middle classes who are the best educators in democracy, in fact.
And actually talking about institutions and how we decide, somebody's asking here, how do you see the relationship between Brussels, Wallonie and Flanders impacted after the COVID? Do you think there has been any significant changes that will survive this crisis?
Well, again, my assessment is that there are two schools, again, in Belgium. First of all, there is a general agreement that we cannot go on with the fragmentation and segmentation of competences as it is today. It was very difficult to combine the different levels of the power structures and of state organization. Now there are two options, of course. It's regionalize and localize much more. And for instance, separate the social security system into the regions, or putting more competences at the federal level. And I don't know what the real balance is. That is going to be the big question for the next government, because everybody knows that we don't have a stable government at this moment, that the crisis has been led by a minority government supported by parts of the opposition only. And that is being the big question. Is the Flemish Nationalist Party going to be an important power in the next government? Then we will have segmentation and fragmentation towards the region. If it is another axis that is being formed, maybe some of the competences are going to be put on the federal level. What in any case is going to happen, I think, that is that the Brussels capital region, the Brussels urban area, is going to gain in autonomy. That it's 3 times as big as the next city in Belgium. It is very complex, cultural wise. It is so it's so specific that it needs its own type of government. And I think the Brussels government is going to be reinforced after the crisis.
Lots of food for thought there.
Yes.
On what will happen in our institutions and how on our decision making. There's another, just to move on, another cluster of questions is about traveling. You know, of course, as we're all not many from here, and we're all having that in mind. So how do you see that opening it up, and how do you think are the chances for some of us to go back in the summer to our respective countries?
Well, it's 2 questions, because going back to your home, wherever that may be, and traveling is 2 different questions. I think there's going to be an arrangement for people to go back to their families in the summer. I mean, I think that's a logical question of regulation, even within COVID regulations. I think that well, you know that there has been an incident with Moroccan Belgians that have been confined in Morocco 2 months before return to their home, which was Belgium, but they had the double nationality. And so, okay, so I think there's going to be an arrangement there, but that's not really traveling, and that's visiting your family. As far as traveling is concerned, I think that business traveling is going to be radically reduced. The habit that we had to meet people in a meeting, we are going to meet in different ways business-wise. And I think there's going to be an overall reduction. I think there's going to be an overall reduction into the mode. I think there's no reason I can see why, let's say, airborne transportation will remain the same as before. I think Europe, for instance, Europe is going to redevelop night trains, speed train connectivity, and I think that is going to be one of the transitions. What is a big question mark for me is tourism, which is traveling for leisure. And there, well, I don't know. I don't have a fixed answer. On the one hand, of course, it's a very important part of the economy. Globally, it's the second important economic sector. And in Europe, especially in the peripheral zones, it's the only way, in fact, for poor areas to attract purchasing power from rich areas, is to bring people to the sun, or to, that is, it's going to be European tension. And you see already today that the coastal areas in Spain, for instance, a country that has been very affected by COVID, is reopening. But of course, how are we going to organize that? I don't have a clue. How can you be in beaches or in tourist attractions without gathering? I don't know. So I don't see the business model, a new tourist business model, except when you put it for rich people and make it more expensive, for instance. And then, of course, privatization might be one of the outcomes. You go to the beach, but you pay double of the price, and only those who can afford it are selected, in fact, to do that. So that's a dangerous element, but I don't know what is going to happen, because it's a lobby work also. It's not only rational planning that is deciding, it's also political influences, territorial interests. And so we see today in Belgium, in a small scale already, that the mayors of the coastal municipalities in Belgium are resisting, are not applying, or saying they are not going to apply the latest measures of let's say, slow exit scenarios, because because the sun is coming back, they want their second home owners to be allowed to go to the coast and to consume there. So there are two elements. Okay, so it's an economic struggle. And I don't know what at that level travel is going to be reduced. But I think in the professional side, there's going to be a fundamental restructuring. We are going to need less traveling, and I think that those who need travel for negotiation or showing off, etc. But for instance, in my field, in the academic field, the use of international conferences and going forth and by to meet colleagues, that is structurally coming to an end, I think.
There's other questions, for example, about safety and how is it being organized, because it seems that there has been a promise that all citizens, all inhabitants in Brussels will be provided with a mask. Do you have any information about that, and how is that going to pan out? Is there going to be enough mask for everybody? Who's going to distribute it? How can we get information on that?
Yes, in the mask discussion, I think there's going to be enough masks. As far as my information reaches, and the region and the municipalities are really doing their best to do that in two ways. It's ordering masks. It's putting masks also in the big surfaces. You know, there is a conflict now between the pharmacies and the food shops that could also distribute masks. And there is a big movement, I have to say, by self-provision of masks. There's a lot of voluntary work. There's a lot of voluntary women, like in the war industry, producing masks today. So I think that the provision is not the real question. The real question is going to be the disciplinary use of it. Because of course, masks is an altruist act. You do not protect yourself with a mask, you protect the others with a mask. And so to have a protective system, security, everybody should wear it. If everybody wears the mask, then we reduce, of course, risks when you are together in a space. But there, of course, we're going to see happening. And so social control is going to be, for me, social control is going to be much more important than the distribution of the material masks. There's a lot of hysteric discussion on it. Everybody who wants really having a mask will have a mask, I think.
Well, we're having some colleagues saying that in Etterbeek, everybody's getting masks the same way with the city of Brussels are also providing masks. But it seems that there is an unequal distribution according to where you are. And yes. Also, I think, as you were saying, it's going to be very important how we're going to be implementing the safety measures, because we're humans, as you said at the start. Yes. And there's also some indication that we will have to use them also in public transport, right? We will have to use...
No, it's obligatory. You will not enter the metro or the bus without a mask. And so there at that level, it's obligatory, and I think it's a good measure. It's impossible as a business plan to maintain a metro or a bus system with only 10 people in the bus. So if you want a public transportation, if you want to enter together one vehicle, you will it's obligatory to have a mask.
But if not everybody's getting it, how are we going to implement that, especially for those who have not access to a lot of money to be able to buy them in the pharmacies?
Yes, but there again, I mean, the mask we need is covering mouth and nose. So the mask you need is textile of a certain density before. I mean, I don't think you can really say that their individual responsibility is you don't need to change every 20 minutes a medical mask in pharmacy bought at 50 euros for 10. No, you need what I have here. I mean, I have just a simple homemade, not by myself, but a homemade mask, and I wear it when I go to the shop or when I go outside. It's as simple as that. So I really think that this discussion on putting the responsibility to the authorities and distribution networks, I mean, I really want to see somebody who desperately wants a mask and not getting it. Then, okay, if that case is there, then we will publicize it and try to solve it. But I really think it's now a question of leaving that hysterical question and how and when. And
indeed,
you know, we Belgians in general, of course, do not apply rules. They really think in the first place, how can I adapt the rule to my personal wish? And so the discussion about masks is a lot.
Do you think it's going to change? Do you think that Belgium tradition that you just explained about evading the rule or trying to adapt it, do you think it has been impacted somehow? Will we be seeing some societal change of that scale?
Personally, I hope so. But as I say, if people involve themselves more in politics or in societal questions, they will probably behave in another way. But what we see today is a lot of this kind of continuous individual behavior. It's not going to change that fast. So that's going to lead to some reinforcement and repression. Without that, people are, self-government is not going to be sufficient, I think.
And you were talking about how it impacts. You think that art is going to be the last one to be able to, to be able to be rolled out to everyone, and that there will be a suffering of the art industry. Do you have any view of how the art can be reinforced, supported? E-art, does that work? Any ideas?
Yes. Well, again, a big field. I mean, I'm involved in a lot of discussion groups in Brussels because I'm very involved in the art sector for reasons of the question, what is cosmopolitan art? How can we unite Brussels transversally? I mean, beyond the communitarian, beyond the repertoires of each community. What I think there again, what is going to happen is that we have now the end of the kind of international festivals where the Kunstenfestival des Arts, for instance, in Brussels, but also Avignon or the Marseille Festival or whatever, where you bring the world together, where you invite groups from everywhere for 2 weeks or 3 weeks to show off in your city. I think that is going to be very difficult to restore that. For the reasons we have discussed before, which means that art and artists are going to be rooted again in some way. And they will have to connect to the world from their place in a certain way. So I think that festivals and spectacles and productions are going to be confronted with an artistic challenge. First is how to express our new connectivity to the world, because art has a universal reach, but they did do it as, let's say, with the kind of thing that could be produced everywhere, part of the global culture in a certain way. So we will have to think how to be Brussels in the world, how to be Paris in the world, etc. And I think this connectivity will be related with the other elements of localization that we have already touched to, and how that is going to be formatted. Honestly, I don't know. I really personally think that proximity and physical proximity is part of the art. I don't speak about visual art, musea. I think the musea are going to be opened promptly, and there you can regulate it. This is an individual experience with a piece of art or with your friend, and you communicate, but you don't need a public. But some forms of art need a public, and the public needs to feel each other. I don't believe you can invent a good theater experience with 15 people. So what about music festivals? I mean, the big part of the experience there is being together and not only the music. And so my stake in that is that we are going to go to a crisis situation for 6-7 months before there is a vaccine and you can have immunity in a certain way. And that is going to solve more of the questions which are not going to be solved, I think, very easily.
Actually, one of our audience here is saying that in Portugal, cultural sites like theaters and cinemas and museums will be reopening as from the 18th of May, subject to security rules. So in some countries are going ahead
yes,
with that.
But what are the security rules? 50 people with the distance of 1.5 meters. The question, or are they going to open up to everybody? And then, well, then with the risk, of course. So I think that my point is that we need physical proximity to experience some forms of culture and art, and that it's not going to be replaced by distance, physical distance, or internet or other forms. I don't think you have the same experience.
And there's a lot of questions actually about the future of work. Do you think, what are your thoughts? Do you think that what we have experimented because of needs, you know, now, as I said, we have to go online overnight and we're managing the best we can. Yeah. Do you think this is going to stick? Do you think it's going to change? Do you think there's some no return? Or what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think there is not one system of work. Personally, I think that production, physical production, but also mental production needs also forms of proximity. Working in a laboratory, which is not an industry, but needs also interaction, informal interaction. And I think that distance working lacks a bit the informal interaction. When we have a Zoom session together, has to deal with something, with an agenda. It is not just coffee chats. Even that is now invented also, to have a Zoom session without subject. Okay, so my point is, I think the production side will going to be localized and getting together. I don't think everything is going to be homework. This being said, in the service sector and education, parts of it will go on distance. And so distance learning is, or distance meeting is going to be involved. I think that is settled. I think we really, those people who are in those branches, like we, in fact, well, we have been trained over the last 2 months, 2 or 3 times a day in communicating like that. There are some advantages. There is research already on that. There is much more attention. People can speak. People are listened to, and so at the level of communication, distance, a Zoom session or a Skype session has some advantages. And I think we are going to be used and to the informal aspect also to do that. So my point is, I think that homeworking, but again, homeworking when the kids are at school and when you have when your partner has his own infrastructure to work with, etc. So it's a question of spatial and infrastructural elements, but I think that is going to be developed. But then the question is, how are we going to connect, let's say, these kind of immaterial interaction to co-production, really production, and then distribution. And there again, I mean, in my proposal in the neighborhood economy, for instance, what is a lot of our shops do not have internet or a website. the website should be connected locally. So when I buy by internet, that's also something that is going to remain. And the recovery of the economy is bothered by our use now of internet consumption. Well, let's localize that also. Let's localize it through adding to that a distribution mechanism. You buy with your shoes, you buy also your piece of meat and your vegetables in 3 different shops, and there is one delivery with a bicycle that is bringing to you an hour later all these materials together, and not a one-to-one. So I think that the connection of distance is going to be overcome also by these kind of collective organizations, which are not being put in place yet. But you see at the level of experiments that these are now being put in place. In my own neighborhood, the municipality has put together a common website for all the shops in one district. So.
Actually, we're drawing slowly to the end of our very interesting session. And actually, I have the $1 million question for you to finish it. Is that basically, if you think, there's a lot of talk that the virus might be coming back, there might be a second outbreak, and
Yes.
So do you think that, and we have heard all through your brilliant presentation, all the different pressures from the economic side, from the different sectors to get back to business and back to work. So do you think there would be enough courage by our politicians to lock us down again if the situation really gets worse? How do you see that courage of our politicians in taking a decision about going back again to lockdown?
Well, again, first of all, I think there's going to be, how would I say, a learning process. A lot of politicians today compare Sweden with Belgium, with France. So the different systems that have been applied and the different kinds of discipline, and there's a big difference between Holland and Belgium, for instance, between Sweden and Belgium. I think it's through expertise, it's not the politicians immediately, but the experts have nuanciated their convictions over time. And I think what is going to happen is a scientific exchange, more objective exchange. Did Sweden win with their loose system? Did Belgium win with the total lockdown? So the balance sheet is going to be there, and the next phase is going to be instructed by that balance sheet. For instance, we underestimated the psychological negative effects. We don't know exactly how many people in the elderly homes have died because of loneliness, as opposed to, we know that the virus is a very, how would I say, a very dangerous thing, but that the morale is very important to overcome it or not. That your own immune system is also reacting to the will to overcome it or not. So all these complex questions, we will have to learn about it and see whether there is scientific agreement on that. So the next phase is going to be instructed by these new nuances in my field. And then I think that, of course, I really think that the importance of public health is in the head of most politicians. What we will see is, that's my take on it, but that politicians like that put economy first and not safety first will pay a price for that. I don't know what the American elections will bring or what in other situations that will be, but what we see is that, for instance, extreme rightist answers to that against these kind of measures have lost, let's say, influence compared to 2 or 3 months ago. And so my point is, I think that the next phase, that people are going to accept health policy as a first thing, and that there will be a new lockdown if necessary, but with other concrete measures, I think, and not just the lockdown, stay at home, and then for the rest, we don't bother anymore. So that's my take in it. But again, who knows? Courage of politicians, I cannot instruct them. It depends on the individual politicians also and the leadership capacities.
Absolutely. I think that we're almost on the hour. You have got very flattering remarks in the chat. Everybody very grateful for your insights. I think that you have really helped us to have a 360 degrees overview of the situation, because, you know, we're always looking at one aspect or the other aspect, one country or the other, but you have managed to kind of bring us an integrated approach of the things that are happening, and not only to present how they are, but also give us a lot of food for thought about future ideas, because for the moment we hear a lot of it's really bad, we don't know what to do, but you're coming with lots of propositions that I think are left in the fertile ears of our colleagues here in the Commission, and I really hope that some of them can travel. Thank you so much for your overview, for your ideas, for your generosity, for your creativity and your imagination, and I'm hoping to see you very soon again in one of our talks.
Yes, of course, I'm ready to do it again. I'm anxious now to read all the chat remarks that I couldn't follow. And yes,
I think our colleagues can actually tape, for everyone to know, this is a good trick. You can copy and paste all the chat, or you go to the bottom line and you say save chat, and then you will be able to read everything. But don't worry, I think Blanca, my colleague, is making sure that you will get your
okay.
You can look at
it. I'll read them, and maybe next time we can continue this discussion. Thank you very much for
reminding that you're one of our speakers, our regular speakers in the European School of Administration, that you usually come to our sessions to enlighten us precisely on how can we, as European officials, be part of the life of Brussels. Yeah. So there's also the Discover Brussels session that you dedicate to our newcomers. So anyway,
the Brussels for Europe masterclasses.
And Brussels for Europe. Well, do you want to say a couple of things about it before we come?
Yes. Well, we organize for 13 years now already, 2 times a year, a series of 12 masterclasses with lectures, with visits also, and meetings with civil society of Brussels, on Brussels, Brussels for Europe, with the central question, what would it mean for Brussels to become capital of Europe, and what would it mean for Europe to be integrated in Brussels? And let's say the focus of this whole program is to get knowledge shared with the main experts, because we really have a faculty of high standard faculty on the system of Brussels, and then to position the European project in a certain way in that urban context. That's the focus, and we have got more than nearly 700 members of staff already that follow the course, and as you might know, we are very well, let's say, rated by the participants. So I invite everybody to register Brussels for Europe.
Indeed. So people are saying that while we send the recording of your session, we can also send a link to your classes so that everybody knows how to get to them. So we will do that for everyone who's still listening. So anyway, I don't want to keep you any longer, and all our viewers here. Thank you so much, Eric, and hoping to see you very soon. And take care.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Blanca?
Thank you very much to all of you. I will ask Benedict to stop the recording now, if possible. And